Now I get to welcome someone to the stage who is a true heroine, Jennifer Burney, a professor at Stanford University's Doerr School of Sustainability and the Center on Food Security and the Environment. Please give her a huge round of applause.
As an academic, I don't often get woos, so thank you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here and for having me today. I want to talk about the work that my incredible team is doing, thinking about how we can build climate-resilient school feeding programs. So I'm going to step back and start with the definition of food security that is familiar, I think, to probably everyone in the room. But what I want to point out is that school feeding programs can play a really important role. And that's, of course, because children don't have economic or political agency, right? And so they depend on all of us for their nutrition. And we also know that any insults to nutrition in childhood last a lifetime. So sustainable food security matters not just for individuals, but for communities and for entire economies. And when you look at the definition of food security, again, as a starting point, it's pretty clear that climate affects all dimensions of it. So we want to today think about mobilizing, of course, greater commitment and action around regenerative school meals, but I want to think especially about how to do that against the backdrop of a warming climate. All right, so when we look at school feeding programs around the world, here's just a brief summary map of what this looks like. There are school feeding programs in, like 170 plus countries in the world, something like 230 million children. We're trying to up that. But even now, in the programs that are counted, we are feeding something like 25% of the world's children in school. So this is a really big safety net, and it's expanding because, again, folks realize how important this is. However, from the vantage point of my research group, we're thinking about this and we're seeing the number of countries that are feeding increasing numbers of kids, and the fact that some are producing food domestically for their programs, like what you just heard about. Some are importing food. This is a growing and complicated safety net, and the climate risk of this system is really poorly characterized. So what we're doing is thinking about what is the risk exposure of school feeding programs and the network of school feeding programs around the world, and how can we think about mitigating that risk to the extent possible. So when we think about school feeding programs, we want to think about, in particular, what food is going into those meals, and where is it produced, and what is it exposed to, and how's that changing. All right, so we're trying to do three things, excuse me. Number one, we're going to think about the impact of climate on production and prices of different meal components on the plate, and we're going to call this the silent cost of climate change. So we've done a really good job of characterizing what climate change has already done to our ability to grow food and how that impacts programs like school feeding programs. But then we also want to think about how to address those issues. So the second thing we're doing is thinking about how to build resilience into this system. One way of doing that is to think about switches to regenerative agriculture. Another way to do that is to think about, again, the network of programs, not just say within a country, but across countries, and where there's systemic risk and maybe systemic opportunities for resilience, say through coordination or trade. So we want to think about making a globally sustainable social safety net. Oop, didn't mean to laser you. So how do we do that? We start with what's on the plate. When we look at this from a school meals perspective, we see these beautiful plates and we see delicious, nutritious meals for children at school. When my team looks at this, we say, oh, that's rice and beans and lentils and bananas and kale and wheat and oil and so on and so forth. And so we start by taking these plates in each country. We think about each program around the world, and we're thinking about what's on the plate and what it's exposed to while it's produced. So climate change has already affected every producing region on the planet. In addition, every producing region on the planet is exposed to a natural mode of climate variability like El Nino. So there's a lot of issues already day to day in stable production of food supply in many regions around the world. And we also know that that's going to change going forward. So we're thinking about what climate change has already done and what it's likely to do. And from there, we've taken data for every food product on the plates of all school meal programs around the world, and we have generated data to match all those programs with the growing conditions that they're produced in over time, and also climate models of how those conditions are going to change. And so we're able to say, for example, what yields and production of those products would have looked like absent climate change compared to what has actually occurred. And then we're able to project those impacts forward. So we're able to think about what climate change is already doing to school meal programs, what it's likely to do in the future, and how to think about mitigating those risks. So we've developed a broad library of climate and crop relationships, not just for the big crops produced globally like maize or rice, but also for more regionally important crops, like teff or yams, and so on and so forth. And so as an example here, we can get country-specific estimates for how all the crop growing areas within a country have been affected by climate change to date. And so here you see, for example, for Ethiopia, I just put up 4 crops here, negative impacts for 3 of them, and something like about 6% reduction in crop productivity, for example, of maize in Ethiopia due to climate change thus far. Most of the impacts around the world have been negative, not everywhere, but most. And so we're careful to make sure we're really assessing the local impacts around the world. So as an example, here's what we do. If we take a plate, this is just a characteristic plate from one of the programs in Kenya. So we've got rice, we've got beans, we've got some fruit. We match these products with the observed climate relationships that we've developed through that big library of data, and we compare, what would have happened absent climate change with what has happened now, and we look at, therefore, what would the cost of a meal have been absent climate change compared to what it is now. And we're able to convert that into a number of meals for a given program that are not served because climate change has already made it harder. So that's kind of the silent cost of climate change so far. And we're able to also project that in the future and think about how many meals are not served because it's already harder to grow food. So that's the silent cost. But we're also trying to think about solutions. So with another team, a fellow professor in a lab at Stanford who's built a library of regenerative ag trials around the world and where there are paired comparisons between regenerative systems and conventional systems, and developed probabilistic estimates for what a switch to regenerative agriculture would mean for all these crops in any location around the world. And what these little waterfall plots here show you on the right is that for almost every country in the world, a switch to regenerative agriculture predicts higher yields for these big important crops. And so we then can do a similar exercise, which is to take these products on the plate, think about what current production and prices look like, and then say, okay, if we were able to switch to regenerative systems, now this is ignoring, of course, all the hard work to get that to happen, but trying to make the case for that work to be done, right? Which is to say, if we were to switch to regenerative systems, now we can say, in an equivalent way, here's the number of plates you could produce, and it's, in most cases, many more. So as an example here, here's data from 2 countries, Kenya, Ethiopia. Each country has 2 programs. The main program in Ethiopia is really quite large, something like 7 million children. And referencing kind of a business as usual case, you can see that for Ethiopia, for example, the current kind of cost of climate change is tens of thousands of meals not being served. And the current opportunity, those yellow bars, is something like 200,000 meals on the same budget could be served with a switch to regenerative grains. And these effects, when you start to add them up across regions and globally, are quite large. So we've finished preliminary analysis for all the programs in Africa, and it adds up to quite, in some cases, shocking numbers, I would say. So we've got about 60 million children currently being served meals in school, and we estimate the silent cost of climate change to be around 200,000 additional children that could be fed, and that's just from the emergent climate signal to present. That's not thinking about future climate change. But more importantly, when we think about agricultural system transformation, the kind of resilience opportunity for regenerative ag is more than 2 million additional meals, 2.5 million additional meals across the continent. And this is only from thinking about regenerative grains. We're still working to do all the other data analysis to put in regenerative fruits and vegetables. So these are low bars already, low estimates, but sizable numbers. And so we think that both the silent cost of climate change and the opportunity for resilience of system transformation is large. So we're expanding this work to include all programs and as many foods as possible. We're trying to get everything that's on the plate in every program. And we're trying also to compare what we find with, to use what we find to do scenario analyses. So to think about how can we, alter nutrition on the plate in a climate resilient way. So if programs want to think about diversifying, for example, the food products that they offer, we can now do analysis to say, what does that do to your climate risk exposure? Next, we really want to also think about regional scale climate conditions that could be especially detrimental. So one that folks might know about is El Nino. So El Nino connects, El Nino is this warming pattern in the Pacific Ocean, this sort of anomalously warm tongue off the eastern Pacific that arises every few years. And that actually swings around the climate in most regions of the globe. And it has been linked to childhood malnutrition. So in regions that get hotter and drier during El Nino years, you see an increase in the number of underweight children, and then that persists years later to show up as stunting. So we already know that these modes of climate variability matter, and they matter in a synchronized way. So when there's an El Nino year, as one example, right, many programs would be at a similar kind of risk. So how could we think about buffering these modes of variability that hit regions and larger swaths of the world at the same time? All right, and finally, we're working with teams, here in the room, many people represented, and around the world to try to start implementing these resilience strategies into policy and practice. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the rest of the day.
You're like, I don't care about groceries. Keep that round of applause going. Jennifer is a heroine, as I said before. I admire her so much, and I'm glad that somebody is thinking about, the school meals of the future and what we need to prepare for. I'm really excited for this next presentation. We have a keynote by Mariana Mazzucato, professor in economics of innovation and public value at University College London. Please give her a round of applause.
I'm actually not feeling completely in top form, so I asked if I could sit down. I hope that's okay. I'll have to keep turning my neck to make sure you guys all feel happy. So first of all, what a wonderful set of presentations, and I hope mine builds on it, but I also want to be a bit provocative, which is to say, precisely because everything we heard is so important, wouldn't it be great if we actually had a public sector that got that, a private sector that got that, but especially that they work together on these problems that we've heard about and the relationships between climate, biodiversity, health, and well-being, and taking it as seriously as we know we take terrible things like war. And this is a very bad moment to be talking about war because we have geopolitical tension in many parts of the world. But what's interesting with war, or let's just call it the military budgets, is they don't just say, oh, we'll put a bit of money here, a bit of money there, okay, soldiers, go fight. We use all sorts of tools across the world on things like advanced purchasing agreements. That's what the military does in order to get cheaper products, in order to work well with the private sector. They negotiate all sorts of things like intellectual property rights if they're funding things, because they want to make sure that they continue to have access to the things they're funding. So this kind of more proactive way of thinking of what the problem is and being very clear on what they're trying to do, right? It's not just like, think of the moon landing. It wasn't just the space race. It was, we're going to beat the Russians. We're going to go to the moon and back in a short amount of time. So they have these so-called missions. And what's interesting is that as soon as you have a mission, it's interesting to start thinking, what are all the different sectors that you're going to need to help if you want, satisfy that mission. So going to the moon wasn't just aerospace. It was as much materials, nutrition, electronics. And they had all these problems they had to solve. You see where I'm getting at, because you heard today about a lot of problems. And I'll get to school meals in just 2 seconds, but I want to build up to it. All the problems they had to solve, they realized things like, what would the astronauts wear? How would they go to the bathroom? What would they eat? The first thing they realized in NASA is they had to change procurement. They had to change the way that the military was doing procurement away from what's called cost plus, which is basically just kind of, the race to the bottom in terms of who's going to provide something at the cheapest cost, towards challenge-oriented procurement, mission-oriented procurement with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. And so the guy who actually did that, don't ask me how I remember his name because I don't remember half of the things I did this week. His name was Ernest Brackett. He said, we will not be able to go to the moon and back without changing that procurement law. Okay, so fast forward to why we're here. We're not here to talk about war. What does it mean to treat all the problems that you are hearing today, and I'm sure there's going to be great panels after this, as seriously as going to the moon and back in a short amount of time? Imagine if the mission was making sure that every single child in the world had access to at least 2, say 3, but at least 2 healthy meals a day generated with regenerative agriculture, local manufacturing, and also making sure that the conditions of how that school food is made also has good working conditions, so on and so forth. We don't have that. We have, remember when Reagan also said ketchup was a vegetable? Why did he say that? Because he was trying to reduce the cost of school meals, and some of us even had T-shirts with Reagan and then ketchup, and it said, which is the vegetable. But that idea of actually taking really seriously not only these terrible statistics, I'm going to go through some of my slides, not all of them. We know that the global food system has extreme structural challenges. I actually just co-chaired with the president of Singapore and the head of the WTO a water report where we call it the economics of water as a common good. And 55% of the global food chain is at risk if we do not treat water seriously. And 70%, by the way, of the water cycle comes from what's called green water. So when the ground transpires and then the water cycle continues, as long as we continue deforesting and hurting the biodiversity on the ground, these grounds are not spongy and that water does not transpire. And we show that 55% of the global food chain is at risk. So I'm sure you've heard lots of the terrible ways in which we're currently treating our food systems and our water systems, but the idea of a mission-oriented approach, which is what we talk about in this report, and hopefully you saw that little barcode in the beginning, is imagine if we actually took the idea of school meals as an opportunity to do what? To get, let me just get, sorry, to the actual slide. Here we go. You probably can't see that. As an opportunity to do exactly what we did to go to the moon. First of all, not just for one department. As long as we see school meals and school feeding programs as just part of the social protection part of a government or welfare policy, then it ends up not, well, by design, being taken seriously. What would it look like, for example, to do what Brazil is doing, that they say, SDG 2, really important. They've put hunger at the center of their national policy. And then they say, what does this mean for the way that different departments in government, finance, industry, agriculture, education, of course, health, work together to actually commit to and to galvanize investment in both public and private actors, that mission accomplished, to make sure that every Brazilian child has access to 2 healthy, tasty, and sustainable school meals. And in the report, by the way, we look at what's happening in Brazil, which I'll say one more thing about, but also in Sweden and Scotland, and also some communities, my own community in Camden, where I worked quite a bit. And we look at what it meant for those countries, again, to take it as seriously as, unfortunately, we take military-industrial complex problems. And one of the things they did in Brazil, which is really interesting if you think of DARPA in the United States. DARPA, as you know, is the Defense Research agency in the Department of Defense. They invested in the internet. In fact, I wrote a book back in the day basically showing that everything in your iPhone was actually funded by the taxpayer, so internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri. DARPA was critical to that. But what they did in Brazil was they learned the lesson. They said, why is it, again, that for the military we fund things and then make sure we have access? They would never fund stuff that the soldiers didn't have access to. But for everything else, like health, And like food, we don't do that. We have funding programs. Think of the US. We have the National Institutes of Health that put in $40 billion a year for health innovation. And then completely separately in a different program, unaligned, we have Medicare, Medicaid, and different programs that are about making sure that people, well, in this country they don't, anyway, have access to health, right? So by putting them together, as we do with DARPA, ARPA-H here, ARPA-E, what they did in Brazil is they put their national food program at the center of their policy, at the center of how the different ministries were working, but also at the center of their institutional setup, setting up what's called the HEIC, the Health Economy Industrial Complex, where they're both investing in all these different areas that require innovation, new forms of collaboration, innovation collaborations, worrying about, again, getting the intellectual properties not to be too strong, too wide, and too upstream, at the same time that they're thinking about access of the citizens to those health policies. So I think that's an incredibly important point. And the other thing they've also done is they've put things like the hunger policy and the ecological transition policy at the center of the finance ministry. In the report, we also, as I mentioned, look at Sweden. What Sweden has done, they start with a very high-level challenge to make sure that they have a carbon-free welfare state. State, basically, like everything that the state, because welfare here means something very specific. Anyway, welfare state meaning what the state does for the welfare of people. And then, again, they bring it down to what it means for all the different ministries. And that's precisely why they then used the school food program as a way to make sure that they had that interministerial collaboration. And in Scotland, one of the things we looked at, I mentioned procurement, which is a demand-side instrument, also looking at the whole innovation system, so how they could use a new public bank, the Scottish National Investment Bank. It's a public bank. You know, there's almost 24 trillion in public banks worldwide, but they're just funding cute little projects here and there, and they're not actually leading off into transformative change like the one we're talking about here. But Scotland thought about its school food policy as a way for the different instruments, the public bank, the procurement, the different grants and subsidies that governments have to, again, be better aligned. And don't forget that procurement, by being a demand-side instrument, allows small companies then to scale. So startups scale up. So if they can get the funding from different sources, it doesn't have to be a public bank, from venture capital, from different types of sources, they won't actually then scale. They'll just remain cute and little, but cute and little is not good, right? If they're not scaling, they might also then go bankrupt. So thinking about these public programs, like making sure that every child has a healthy, tasty, sustainable school meal, to generate that intersectoral, so in the business sector, investment, interministerial coordination, but also really taking seriously all those different instruments. I began with procurement, just mentioned public banks, but basically all the levers that governments have to actually be about well-being for society. Thank you so much. I had 100 slides, I showed you two.